All right. Sorry, I had to clear the throat. Welcome back, Internet. I've missed you. It's been a bit. Hello, David King from Mendocino,
What's up,
the die-hard soul food webite out there trying to make a difference, fam. And that's what we're trying to do here on the old Crescent Method. I know a lot of y'all are likely here to hear information on the old wacky tobacco, the old cannabis, the hemp, the indica, the sticky, icky. But today, by golly, we're going to talk about food.
Yep.
Because both Sarah and I made a commitment to the planet that we would try to make food safe for human consumption, that we would try to impart nutrition into the rapidly declining agro-industrial complex.
Yeah.
And, well, damn it, we're just really good at pot. And just like Will Ferrell gets typecasted at Will Ferrell, we get typecasted as the wacky tobacco technicians. And, I mean, I love growing pot. But, you know, it's been a couple weeks now because...
It's definitely been
it's
a while.
been a couple weeks, but we had taken a small actual vacation to actually go on work-free adventures. And we jumped in our little vehicle and we drove 4,443 miles to Virginia and back.
All while gas prices were $5 a gas.
You want to feel alive, Americans? Take a 4,000-mile road trip when gas is $5 a gallon.
Yeah.
Every time we stopped, people said, why in the hell are you in a car with California license plates way out here? And there's a lot of answers to that, really.
So we took a trip.
We did take a trip.
To see Mr. Joel Salatin.
Shout out
To
one of the most gangster humans I've ever met, Joel Salatin.
Very graceful man.
Man.
Lovely individual.
I'll be completely mind blown. Whoa, David King eats food too. So David King, food's important to you, food's important to me. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what we learned at old Uncle Joel Salatin's farm for his 2 Days of Truth workshop where, what did we do, Sarah? What exactly did we do with this event?
Well, it was an event mainly geared around health and different ways to address health and come to health with different types of alternative modalities and alternative practitioners in the field. So it wasn't necessarily farming based, but we did get a tour of Joel's facilities and got to see how he runs the land at least a bit, and also we took the cow trough challenge.
I drank the water out of the cow trough, fam.
It was delicious, actually.
I drank the cow froth. We did get a little case of the old-fashioned Spanish influenza, but I don't think it had anything to do with the cow trough water.
That was like a week later.
Yeah, so nonetheless, we did drink the water out of the cow trough. I'm a recovering vegetarian, and the first meat product I stopped eating was pork, probably 15 years ago, and I ate massive plates of Uncle Joel's pork, and it was delicious.
It was delicious, and they didn't season it. They didn't put any sauces on it or anything. It was just straight up cooked really well, just the pork itself, and it was absolutely divine.
Yeah, it was
amazing.
I still don't see myself eating any pork, but when you're in Rome, you eat the Romans' pork. You eat the pork, man.
Yeah.
Joel
it was delicious.
Well, and you couldn't get around with it. They crammed pork into damn near every meal while we were there, which is kind of funny for people that don't want to eat pork. But
speaking of nutrient density, right?
I think that's the important component.
That's what we wanted to bring up is, so normally when we're, eating in our regimen, we utilize a really good protein powder, and it kind of keeps us going and gives us enough nutrients, and it's made from a specific physician that kind of takes the same approach that we do for the soil, but for humans and the human terrain. Yeah. So normally that's in our regimen, but for this trip, and specifically for this little stint that we were at Joel Salatin's farm, we didn't even feel the need to take that protein powder, really. The food itself, the chicken, when we had that chicken for lunch that day, Like that's all we needed. That's all we needed was that chicken. We didn't even need any dinner. I wasn't even hungry because it just was so filling and so tender and delicious and well beyond any other. I mean, I don't even know how to explain how delicious this chicken was. You didn't even know that chicken could be like that. It just is so incredible in its texture, in its flavor, in what's not in the chicken. You know, it was just amazing. So shout out to Joel Salatin for figuring out how to do chickens and beef and these grazing animals in a really nutrient-dense way and providing that information to everybody on the planet to be able to copy that.
I would like to accentuate what Sarah said in that we take this protein powder as an absolute necessity of surviving on the road and operating at a high level. As a Soil Food Web advisor, you put in a tremendous amount of effort to show up to a farm, and if a farm, gathers up the money to fly you out and put you up for a couple days, they get their money's worth out of you. And, you really spend an intense amount of hours and effort. And this protein powder, plain and simple, holds it together for us.
Yeah.
And it's been an essential staple in our diet for several years now. And we don't go anywhere without it. The nice thing about the protein powder is if you end up, like we have been, canceled flights and shifted across the country and all kinds of bullshit, you can live on the protein powder and be just fine. And so it's kind of like this, survivalist thing. And from the moment we started eating the meat from Joel's farm, it wasn't even in our mind to, hey, I need to take my protein powder that day. Like it was,
just didn't even need it.
And it was something you didn't realize till like 2 or 3 days later. And what was interesting is even on the very difficult drive home, we weren't chugging down powder on the drive home. And, we hear about these things, right? Lots of people say nutrient density and living soil and soil food web and mineral chemistry and nutrient density. And we've been able to do it in certain aspects in our personal garden growing vegetables. But the real consequence of being a farm advisor is your garden is last on the list. You know what I mean? It's like the mechanic that just can't work on one more car when they get home. And so, we've seen examples each year in our personal garden where the soil food web techniques and chemistry balancing led to remarkably dank lettuce. But we haven't had an opportunity to grow broiler chickens. We haven't been able to raise a hog or two or raise a beef. And so, I mean, I don't mean any disrespect to anybody in the permaculture world, but there's a lot of flakes and flarns and filth flam shit. And Joel Salatin is a real deal, man. That is a certified, grandfathered in, made man in the aspects of living it, breathing it, doing it. I mean, he took us around his farm. We didn't see everything, but as farm advisors, we saw enough to know if this dude's full of shit or not. And man, I just...
Excuse me, sorry. Still recovering.
Yeah, we're not subscribing to the COVID narrative, but we did go through an old-fashioned influenza spell.
But one thing I wanted to say, though, when we were touring Salatin's farm, I was very impressed with his knowledge and use of carbon in his systems. So, one of the very first places that he took us on the farm was this giant shed with many slots in the shed for basically just chipping up wood chips and just filling that thing full of all kinds of brown material to utilize carbon effectively on his farm so that he can reduce or control the waste, control the smell. He uses it to absorb all the urine and things like that, especially when they're his animals are overwintered. And then he does a really clever way of running through the animals on his farm in a very precise and timed
Yep.
way. Yeah, the carbon diaper.
Yeah.
I was just really impressed with his knowledge and use of the carbon in appropriate ways, and then also moving the animals the way that he does. There were no smells on the farm, not even in the pens. So he gets that. He gets keeping things aerobic to the best of his ability, and then allowing the pigs to come in and churn after the cows have been in that.
Maybe explain that process so people can follow along. So essentially what he does is during the winter time when they're feeding hay bales, they usher all the animals over to this kind of corridor, and they have an adjustable feed station, almost like a window washing thing, so that they can keep piling wood chips to mix with the manure. And then they work in corn, was it?
Yeah, they work in corn.
Corn. And then
Into the ground.
into this area, this trough. So you got a wood chip, horse shit, or cow shit, and then they run the pigs through it. So
after the cows have been on it for a certain amount of time and have saturated that that carbon diaper, then they run the pigs through it to eat the corn and to churn it up and to get it aerobic again, because it's been fermenting for a bit, for however long he allows the cows to be in that particular spot.
Yeah.
And this is when they're not moving out on the land where they're doing the mob grazing. This is what he does in the wintertime with his cows.
And I'll have to say, like, the difficult part about being a legitimate soil food webite and being fully properly educated on how the soil food web actually works, it can be difficult to go hear other advisors talk about the biological systems, because usually what they're saying is not grounded in any reality that we would agree. And a lot of times it's completely contrary to any real scientific understanding of biological systems. And I'll have to say, I was impressed with how Joel described it to people, because it can be very difficult. And even though I don't know that I'll say confidently, I would not have dreamed up the idea that he is using to manage this manure and urine pile throughout the year and turn it into a safe compost product to then spread on his land. I have to say, it's really clever what he did. I was really impressed with absolutely everything on this farm.
No flies,
man.
No flies to speak of, really. No smells.
And very docile animals. We had a couple hundred people standing out at a field with all the cattle, and they didn't even mind. And, you would think that'd be a time to make a cow skittish. And they were just so calm and peaceful, and we just walked right through them like splitting the Red Sea.
But they weren't like all and
they weren't
zoned
dumb.
out. They were very lively and vibrant, and they had personality to them. But they were easygoing, So they weren't like charging you. They weren't necessarily skittish. They were getting out of your way. But they were very aware of you and very alive, like vibrant. I would just say, like, the life force in these cows was off the hook on any cow I've ever seen, really.
Yeah.
We did not test the soil.
No, so I think this
that would be
is
a little aggressive.
well. I think this is where your personal ethics come into play, and man, it really. I wanted to grab. We were in the field all day. I could have grabbed a soil sample, but I think we're really big on consent,
Yeah.
And
consent's important.
And I do trust that which is for you will not pass you by, and if it is an opportunity for us to work directly with Joel Salatin, that opportunity will arrive.
Well, we do have an opportunity,
and we do, and it already kind of did. Yeah.
So
Sarah got her hustle on while we were there, and got found an inn. Man, I was dying to know the biological makeup, and honestly, what I'm super interested in is the soil chemistry makeup, and I have full faith Joel has got a system that's working. My concern would be compost. Even if you let it sit forever, it doesn't end up what we would say Albrecht balanced. And so if you're making, so I'd have two, I guess, for those soil food webby consultants following along, what my mind thought of when I saw this process was, how consistently and evenly is he spreading this carbon diaper compost material across his land? Because that will trend to create variation in soil chemistry over time. So I would be interested in what variation is being forced onto this landscape by how that compost is spread. So if it's coming from point A and they pick it up in a forklift and they go this way across the field, you're always going to have more buildup closer to where you're moving it from. It's just basic human mechanics. And most people don't keep track of where they spread compost and things like that. And so I would think if you dissected that property, there would be a somewhat uneven distribution of that compost material that would be visible on a soil chemistry test. So that'd be my first concern, or my first question that I would love to answer. But again, not going to just grab soil out of some dude's property.
But I think he uses the manure and the way that he moves the animals across the landscape to really do the bulk of the fertilization. And he's really only after growing grasses, and he's managing the succession of the grassland and the health of that soil based on the grazing, the mob grazing. So if you caught like the first little section where we were playing one of his videos, just the audio of it, he's just talking about how the way that he mob grazes specifically with the cattle is that he forces them into a tighter mob, right? And they have to then eat everything in there. They're not selective because they don't have the room to spread out. And so he doesn't allow necessarily weeds to get out of control because they're eaten and they're then pooped out and returned in the form of manure to the landscape. And when we were walking through those fields, it wasn't like there was old manure really anywhere. There was all the manure that we saw was fresh. And so he really does freshly graze, and that's fresh manure that he drops down. Then he waits a certain amount of time to allow his, I think, the egg layers to come through and pick out any of the larvae that will then have...
We should probably explain the process. So generally speaking, what he does is he has the cows run across the field to mow the grass down because the chickens won't eat long pieces of grass. So the cows need to go through and get it down to a certain height.
Yep.
And then they drag the chicken tractors, or well, I guess they're not chicken tractors because it's the meat broiler.
Yeah, I mean, he
something.
still calls them a chicken tractor.
Yeah. But it's not the egg-laying chickens. They're just meat chickens.
He's got two types that he uses in different ways.
Yeah, so the cows go through, eat it up, mow it down, poop it up. Then they run the egg-laying chickens through a certain number of days after to eat all the larvae and flies out of the manure, which... sounds like a crazy permaculture thing that doesn't pan out. That one was working.
Definitely pans out. No flies.
That one is real at Joel's farm. Because there's a lot of crazy ideas out of permaculture that don't just pan out, no disrespect. But that was expertly executed.
Yeah.
Shout out to Joel. That was... And
so then after that,
yep,
after he runs through the egg layers to get the fly larvae out of the cow patties, at some point he's running through, now the grass has been eaten down to a certain height. Now he runs his broilers through there in a very staggered, methodical, strategic fashion. And chickens don't like really tall grass. So he grazes it down to a certain level, runs, after a couple of days, runs the egg layers through for the larvae, and then he'll run the broilers through to... get up any other grubs and things like that.
Absolutely amazing.
Once the grass is down to a certain height. So
it's
pretty brilliant.
His method is so beautifully executed from a production standpoint. The dude's real deal.
Yeah. I think he said when he started out on that farm, because their family hasn't owned it for like generations. It's
been a while,
just this
60
one
years.
generation that's been on this land.
It
And
was rock.
they didn't, it was pretty bare rock. There wasn't much soil to speak of. So they have literally built the soil to, I think, 12 inches depth, didn't he say?
Yeah.
8 to 12 inches depth.
I'm sure there's videos online where he talks about it, but it had been improperly farmed during the, right before the Dust Bowl, and they, broke it out, young man, was the term of the day around the Homesteaders Act, when white people took all the land. Nonetheless, that's another conversation, but, severely damaged the land. It blew away and was rocks and gravel. And he told a story about his dad. His dad told the neighbor that someday he's going to run several hundred head of cattle on that land. The guy hysterically laughed at him. And Joel said his dad came home and actually cried that day about how hurt he was, and he made a promise to never share his dreams or goals with anybody ever again, and just decided to do it.
Just do it, yeah.
Which is the way you do it. Deepak Chopra says that don't tell your dreams to the world, whisper them to spirit, and execute them. And I think there's something to that, other than just not being laughed at by your peers. But we go through that constantly. I mean, people laugh at us constantly what we've been producing, and I appreciate the people that listen to the show that can hear what we're saying, but. And he slowly turned it around with this method. And I think the stat he gave was a typical industrial farm can handle, they call it a cattle acre day or something like that. And the typical number is 80 head of cow on 1 acre for 1 day, or 1 cow for 80 days on an acre is the planting density, so to speak, of cattle. And he gets something like 800 or 400
cow days.
400 cow days on that same acre with the method that he does. So he's far more intensely and healthily grazing. And the animals were vibrant. I mean, they were,
very vibrant.
and I just want to go back to the nutrient density component, because we see this every day in our cannabis work. We produce compounds, smells, terpenes, potency that is not produced in any other method of agriculture every day in cannabis. And that gets people really high, and that's fun. And people enjoy that when we provide that service for them. But to see it in a meat and eat it and feel what that was like in my body is, I'd say, one of the more life-changing moments I've had in this entire agricultural journey. And, the first main key moment was when I went to an aquaponics farm in Salinas called Viridis, and ate the tomatoes there. And that was the week I became a vegetarian, because I was so mind blown with the flavor of those, really nutrient dense vegetables that were produced on that farm. And I feel like going to Joel's was that experience with meat. And the craziest part, where it's exactly like cannabis but different, is if you take a bunch of people that are used to growing small salt-grown midzy weed, they'll smoke a lot of it and keep smoking it. But a lot of times the living soil flower doesn't get totally consumed, because people get wrecked and fall on the floor and start falling asleep. And that same thing happened with chicken breasts. And, everybody went through the line and took their visual portion of what they thought they wanted to eat. And what was crazy is the chicken was so nutrient dense that you got full about halfway through the portion that you took. And they even warned you. They said, look, eat as much as you need. Please don't waste it. It's going to fill you up. And every single person went and got their 2 or 3 chicken breasts. I took the whole half. They offered it. I took it. And I mean, I really had to force myself. I was stuffed. And then not needing dinner at all that night. And you hear these things. You hear these USDA studies of food from the 40s, and it's declined.
Yep.
What is it? I don't know what
at
the
least 40% on
I
most
mean,
crops.
something ridiculous.
Yep.
And to kind of jump in a time machine with Joel and eat a chicken the way my grandpa would have eaten it as a kid, and feel satiated and feel vibrant and feel alive. And we get that effect with cannabis, but I guess what I'm mumbling on and on for is I am craving that for food,
Yeah.
Sarah and I spend a large portion of our budget on the highest quality food we can support. I feel like voting with your dollars is the best thing that you can do, and we try to support high quality producers of food. We support the alternative grocery stores because we want to see those things thrive. I grew up on a farm where we processed 4-H animals and ate those, and it still was nowhere near the experience I just had at Joel Salatin's farm. And I say quite often, I remember growing up as a kid eating those 4-H animals, and even identifying as a 12-year-old that was different than the ground beef I got at Stater Brothers at home. And, I don't know. The whole food thing is just so overwhelming, man.
Well, it's a very important topic, especially right now, given the state of collectively the health of at least this country, but really around the world of what's going on. And, we've talked about before, if any of you have seen our video with Dr. Arden Anderson on the FCP project, the Future Cannabis Project, where we talk about Pottinger's cats. And that particular research is very important, because as a basic research project, they just took cats and they took the same diet, but they just split it up into the same diet that is microwaved versus not microwaved. And that was really the only difference in this diet.
That was one of the studies. They did a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, they did a lot of different stuff.
The most profound was when they fed cats microwave cat food.
Yeah. And it was the same diet between the control and the test subjects. So, and they saw a huge marketed decline in health to where it just completely degenerated in that one generation of cats, to where, they noticed that in their pens, it was all weeds started growing in their pens. Their offspring were having a hard time actually having offspring. And when they did, they were, emotionally out of control and just really difficult to mentally be a calm cat.
So dramatic effects on temperament, violence. The interesting part about that nutritional study done on cats called Pottinger's cats, which we were going to do a whole episode on, maybe we will. But
we will.
Nonetheless, it took 4 generations for the genetic damage to undo itself.
Yes.
In the cats that were fed microwave food, and that makes me feel like cannabis. Whereas if a cannabis farmer was, worth their salt and could really repair genetics, a lot of people in the olden days would say it'd take about a year to fully rehabilitate a cannabis plant that had gone through hell and back to get it back to its full capacity, which is about 4 generations. And I thought that was really interesting how the cats also took roughly 4 generations to start growing normal again after a severely compromised diet.
And that's a concerted effort to bring their health back, where they're actually in control of the food that they're giving the cats and their health. So
I don't know how to deal with food, man. Food is you would think cannabis would be a lot harder to change than food, but they got food on lock, y'all. It is locked down.
From the subsidies that keep them locked into programs that don't work, and definitely degrade our soils, to just a plethora of inundated food market that's cheap, with no nutritional value and full of toxins. So, that's going to lend itself to mental instability and temperament issues, and not being able to solve problems at any scale. Any way you look at it, it's fundamental to just human thriving on the planet to actually have nutrient-dense food that's full of life vitality, full of all of those phenolic compounds and phytochemicals and all of the anti-cancer compounds that food should be full of. And if we don't have those microbes in the soil to translate those minerals and those compounds to what the plant needs when it needs it, in the form that it needs it, all those vitamins and all those things, all of that genetic conversation that happens between microbes and plants, that's what gives you that plethora of the medicinal compounds. And we know that because of the work that we do, but cannabis is leading the charge in actually being quantified for its medicinal compounds, and all of those compounds that we get quantified, just that show up just from working with an actual soil food web. Yeah. So, it's leading the charge in so many other ways, as far as like finding out where the heavy metals are, how to clean up the heavy metals, where pesticides and different things like that we have an opportunity to utilize what we know about growing cannabis medicinally and cleanly, that we can translate that directly to growing healthy food. Yeah. And we should be doing that. If we want our generations to survive and thrive and actually be able to be innovative and be healthy and see a reduction in chronic disease and illness in our society, we've got to get microbes back into our soil. And it's going to take more than that. Unfortunately, the context of most soils today have been so degraded that we actually have to put mineral balance and nutrition to really get the economic impact from that for farmers to stay viable in bridging that gap. So it's all very important, but getting the medicine back in our food is paramount to reducing that chronic disease and the viruses that we're then now susceptible to. And that's the thing about all of this, is that we get hung up on pathogens, but it's not the presence of the pathogen that determines disease. It is the absence of the beneficials that determines disease and outcome of health. So, that may seem, totally common and logical to this audience. We're hoping that gets out as a more logical thought process to the larger collective consciousness, or at least trickling in and infiltrating that thought. It's about terrain and who you select for. And we as humans, we have free will, and we get to choose how we go about cultivating our land, cultivating our crops, what we put in our mouths, and should be what we put in our bodies. We should have, my body, my choice kind of thing.
That's gone this year, fam. It's out. No more choices.
So
Yeah.
So food is one of those things that we really need to embrace and really get that nutrition back and take that charge now more than ever to really restore the medicinal component back to our food. Yeah. So our food doesn't taste like cardboard anymore. It has life vitality. It has the nutrition, the vitamins, all of the compounds that we haven't even measured yet, that come from this communication between the microbes and the plants.
Yeah.
So
and we don't need to fix the entire food system. There was a moment where Sarah and I, early in our consulting, were pretty overwhelmed with the concept of how difficult it would be to actually affect the large-scale ag system, and realize there's fairly futile efforts, to be completely honest.
Well, it's mindset, it's
subsidies,
so many problems, politics.
So many problems.
It's a lot. Yeah.
And so I felt pretty overwhelmed by that because, I come from an agricultural family where we would go into hundreds and hundreds and thousands of acres of crops. And so we would go grade the produce before my uncle would broker it across the United States and around the world. And so we would go into the actual fields. And so my mind saw food to the people in these massive landscapes. And so I never thought that much could be done in a suburban backyard in California. And in 2012, I met a guy that was, for the most part, for providing most of the nutrition for him and his two small sons out of a small San Diego backyard. And our friend Courtney, who goes by Utopia Seeker on Instagram, is producing like 4 or 5 families worth of food on a goddamn postage stamp by Disneyland. And so what I learned in that is you don't necessarily need to provide all the nutrition for your life in your backyard. But if once a day you can go back into your backyard and eat even a little bit of some herbs that has life force in it, that has mineral density, that was grown with actual soil food web organisms, that can have a tremendous benefit on your body. And that's what we really try to do. Not so much in the last year, but in most years we travel so much during farming season, it's hard to really get the production out of our personal gardens that we would want. And so all that's really there for us is some nice little toppings to our salad, tons of tomatoes actually, and just trying to once a day, we're really good at tomatoes. Turns out tomatoes grow like cannabis. Cannabis does not grow like tomatoes. So, but anyways, we produce a shitload of tomatoes. And what I learned is that if you can just grab a little bit of life force food each day, you can have tremendous benefits to your health. Yeah. I want to go back to a couple comments here before we get too far away. This is one of the biggest deals right here. I hear too many market gardeners say testing doesn't matter. And so what you need to understand is where that information is coming from. And the question I have is, why is that information being provided to farmers, and what is the intended outcome to convince farmers not to test? And there's a lot of organic gurus right now. You know who I'm talking about, and I hope he comes on someday. I would really love to hear why Mr. Trump encourages so many people not to do testing. And I would really love to know what the value is to dissuading farmers from educating themselves on where they are at in the world. You cannot make a correction change if you don't know where you're at. Anybody, I'm going to go ahead and throw this out here. Anybody that is trying to dissuade you from testing does not have your best interest in mind. I will make that bold claim right here on the internet right now.
Well, and furthermore, I wanted to say something about market gardening. It's or just gardening in general. When they say something like that, it is a mindset. They likely have a cabinet or some place where they reach for pesticides, and that can be something that is just people just accept that they're going to need to spray for pests. Right. When we would say, well, why not take that effort, do the testing, and actually mitigate those problems before they actually happen so that you don't even have to deal with pests and you don't have a pesticide cabinet. We don't have a pesticide cabinet.
No.
You know, I actually took a market gardening course and they have in that course a whole thing on pesticides, the cabinet, how to deal with your local officials and things like that, how to record down all your pesticides. And to me, and this is an organic type of market gardening and some of the best in the business, and I would still say is some of the best in the business. But, you know, if we can understand how the testing fits into it, how the minerals and the microbes can work together, even in an intensive system like market gardening, you can replace pesticides with nutrition. You can be much more strategic about, you know, the quality of the food that you produce. It's not that they're not producing good quality. It's just that at some point in time, we need to change our thinking and understand that where we put our money, where we put our investment of time and energy could be much more well spent if we did it on testing proactively what those microbes and minerals would be that are missing so that you get even bigger yields, even better bang for the buck. And pesticides aren't cheap. You know, they're expensive and it's labor and it's time, and we would rather see you spend that labor, that energy, and that time utilizing nutrition and things like that. So, you know, it's just about switching your mindset about how you can actually accomplish the same goal. And I wanted to bring up along with that my sister is actually on here, but she's been following us for a bit. She started out just doing the microbes in the beginning, and this year she actually decided to do the mineral balancing in addition to the compost extracts that we've taught her how to do. This was the first year that she said that her kale like literally grew out of all of the bugs. Like so she had some bugs on the bottom, but as the kale grew,
After
they
the
did
mineral
not.
applications.
After the mineral applications, they grew beyond that, and she's had a bumper crop, huge yields, but she said that the texture and the quality of that kale is beyond what she has ever seen kale to be, to the point where, you know, normally she'll freeze her kale and it'll freeze, but now it's so nutrient dense that it actually doesn't even freeze. It's still pliable when she takes it out of the freezer. So very interesting, you know, when you get those Brix levels that high, that the texture and the quality and the way that the food behaves is very different, you know. So so she's a testament to and a believer in what we do now, and she's had a bumper crop this year with her kale and her chard and all those things. So
and in that situation, all we did was match the sulfur to the phosphorus to the calcium levels, and interestingly enough, kale and cruciferous brassicas need a lot of sulfur. So does cannabis. Interestingly enough, if you take the amount of micronized sulfur the typical OG grower sprays on their crop through the harvest to keep it from being mold free, is the bare minimum of sulfur that's likely needed in that soil to get it above the minimum level. I've done the calculations before. That's a really interesting combination. Pineapple kale smoothies. You go on with your bad self.
Yeah, that sounds
You got to do
delicious.
something to make the cow palatable.
Yeah.
But one thing I would like to say that, soil chemistry
Yes.
is remarkably
It is.
dynamic.
Yeah, and so, but just getting your feet wet and getting used to when is the appropriate time, and you know, we know what the timing is with cannabis, and we're willing to do those tests for that crop. We get paid on quality, and we have to, you know, thread the needle on pesticides and heavy metals and all those things. So, and you get paid on that quality. Whereas with food, you know, that's something that really has lagged behind. They don't really get paid on quality, so they're not really incentivized other than their own philosophical, you know, own philosophies on the way that they would like to present their work in this world. You know, that's just something they don't test their medicinal compounds in their food. They don't tout those medicinal compounds. People don't buy them based on the percentages of those medicinal compounds. Now,
The only
bionutrient
not
food
bionutrient,
associations trying to change that game with food, but that's still a little ways out. But I think they're on the third generation of the device this
The
year.
only time that quality comes into play, and this was what I was raised on. My uncle was a produce broker. If you've ever eaten a hamburger from a little place called In-N-Out, my uncle for the last about 20 years has been in charge of sourcing the lettuce, the tomatoes, the onions, and the potatoes from Southern California, Salinas, and Arizona to a certain degree, produce to supply all the In-N-Out. And so we would go into these onion fields in Brawley and El Central and in the Imperial Valley, and we would grade the produce, essentially. And that's turned out to be a pretty valuable experience in my cannabis journey, to be able to grade the health of a plant from just looking at it standing in the field. But in the context of produce, the only driving factor for quality is how far they can ship it without a problem.
Right.
So, and that's what my uncle, I think, was really good at, and why In-N-Out trusted him with facilitating his produce is he was one of the few brokers that would go get in the field and get his feet dirty at the start of every new produce season. So when it was melon season, we'd get in that field in the beginning of melon season. When it was onion season, we'd get in the field in the beginning of the melon season. And you could tell how well that farmer was doing that year. And you couldn't necessarily ship it from Southern California to New York, because by the time it gets in that transit, by the time that transit time takes place, the food is starting to rot, and then it gets graded at its destination, and then they start to deduct price, and it gets shuffled to, like Food for Less and other discount grocers and things like that, and becomes an absolute nightmare. And I think the thing that really provided me value from my uncle was getting in the field, seeing the quality of produce, and knowing if you could ship it to New York or not. Metaphorically speaking, actually. But
the more nutrient dense the food is, the higher the quality and the farther you can ship it and have it actually stay good.
Yeah.
And we've had lettuce on some of the very first crops that we grew with the soil food web approach, and some level of mineral chemistry. That lettuce, we had picked it and bagged it and then put it in our fridge, and we had to go on a couple of site visits, so we were actually away from the house for a good month. And by the time we came back, it had been a little over 4 weeks, and we pulled out that lettuce, and it was still crispy.
It was a shocking moment.
Absolutely crispy, completely fresh. And, they say that nutrient-dense food doesn't actually rot. It just dehydrates, and we have seen that to be the case. So,
I think we should take a minute. So let's take a minute to loop back around, and what are the things we can do? We kind of left some daunting shit on you, and it does feel daunting, but the beauty of the one straw revolution is start small, start where you're at. And that's what I really weren't. And honestly, putting straw down or wood chips down is a great place to start.
Yes.
Smiley, I did see your question, and we'll jump back to some kind of random questions. If you got some other kind of random questions, we'll circle back around to get those. So Smiley, if you're still on, one question I have is, are you using citric acid to pH your feed solutions? That would be my first question. But what can we do? So I think on the small scale is, I will say, the type of people that follow our show, the educated soil food web enthusiast, the educated soil chemistry enthusiast,
or just soil regenerative,
soil regenerative.
Soil.
By and large, the educated living soil cannabis farmer is 50 to 100 years ahead of the education of the average farmer that is growing our food. Wrap your mind around that. And mostly that's because more reps. Obviously, you get 4 per year. So every year, 4 full living soil harvests per year, where the corn grower gets 1. And so each year you get 4 opportunities per flowering room, right? So some people have 3, 4, 10, 12 flowering, 26 flowering rooms, 36 flowering rooms, whatever you may got, times 4 is a lot of repetitions. And the thing that I really admire about the living soil community, even though I disagree with a lot of what's said, I do appreciate that in the living soil community, people are trying to be educated. People are now trying to figure out why. They want to know why. And I appreciate that there's an evolution happening in the living soil, which I think it was important to go one straw revolution. I think we were getting too far down the rabbit hole of doing too much hydroponically. And if you move to a do nothing, water only Strategy typically improved quality. I don't agree with the water-only strategy, and you have to participate in agricultural activities to support your unnatural activity. But I do appreciate that there is a translation, or an evolution rather, that we needed to go all the way back to do nothing and do water only to then start to figure out what did we need to do to functionally maintain this agricultural activity to be actually sustainable and actually regenerative.
Yeah.
If you just spread straw and do nothing, that's not regenerative. You can wear the hat all day. It's not going to be sustainable. And those farms go out of business typically in a year.
And we need to get away from the word sustainable anyway.
Yeah.
We have to get it in our minds that at this point,
I'm down.
we've got to regenerate. We can't sustain the status.
Yeah.
We actually have to regenerate and rebuild.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that we're living in a time where this is coming on people's minds more and more, and we're actually seeing people that carry some weight and some louder voices than we do actually start talking about this. I know that Dr. Elaine Ingham is going to do an episode here, I think tomorrow, with Sadhguru, who's doing a big campaign in the world I think it's called Save Soil campaign, where he's been traveling the world, educating political leaders and the UN, things like that, about the need to actually save the soil at a grand scale so that we can turn this around. And the thing is that soil really is the one thing that I think that everybody in this world can get behind. And it doesn't have to be politically charged. We don't even have to talk about climate. We don't have to even talk about food if we don't want to. But if we regenerate the soil, literally all these things start coming into line. Water cycles, climate, food, so many things start coming into line. And part of that regeneration has to be the elimination of pesticides. Yeah. Coming up with different and better, more strategic and more intelligent solutions for regenerating soil that do not include, or very minimally include, like the least caustic pesticide. I'd like to see them completely eliminated. I don't think that we actually need them if we can be strategic, but sometimes at scale, it's hard pressed to convince people that that's the case. So
let's take a short tangent on IPM, because I think one thing that's happening with our communication of not wanting to do IPM, we're not advocating just stopping the IPM protocol, because if a farm is requiring to regularly, repeatedly, constantly apply IPM, there's an underlying issue. And I just wanted to clarify that we don't just come in and pull off, we don't just stop IPM and that's the solution. That's not the solution. You will lose your crop. And so you have to get to the underlying cause of why those pests are there. You need to take a more strategic path for correcting the underlying issues, which is always addressing biology and is always addressing soil chemistry.
Yep.
I haven't seen one single time where a farmer just shot from the hip and corrected these problems without doing some level of quantification. Now, I'm not giving the full holy grail to the lab tests. You still need to, as Sarah says, look at the patient. If the meter and the heart machine says you're fine, but the patient's blue, something's wrong, right? And so we need to get our feet dirty, look at the plant, and then you're also tremendously benefited by basic quantifiable scientific data, and then finding a merging between intention, scientific data points, and what you're seeing in the field. And so I just wanted to clarify that we don't advocate just coming to a farm and stopping IPM protocols. We become very selective. So we will look at the products that the farmer is currently using, eliminate all the unnecessary, and choose one product. The little book behind me, Healthy Crops, which we'll cover next week, is like 265 pages. Don't pull it out. Just come back here. You're going to pull the whole set down. Oh, my God. Don't fucking do it. But it's all glued to. It's fake. It's all foam. It's glued to. It's not even real. This is a YouTube content creator set. Don't touch it. And, so we typically, at farmers spraying 3 crappy products a week, we look at what the underlying problem is and choose the one that needs to be actually addressed. And we'll stick to that one product. We'll reduce the usage of that product while addressing soil chemistry and addressing biology. And that's how you move away. We don't just shut down the IPM process.
Well, and part of that
You know.
is really also addressing the psychological process that the farmer is going through, because
Right.
again, this is not easy when somebody's been swinging a bat and they think they're hitting a home run, you know, they don't really necessarily know any better, but it's the only thing that they're comfortable with. So you have to address what's going on with them mentally, because even though we know it works, we see it all the time, this is a leap of faith for most farmers. They want to believe, they typically study the science behind it, and then that gives them the trust and the gumption to bite off on it. But even then they sometimes can't actually make the leap to not spray something, because
I would say most times.
Most times,
Yeah.
actually, yeah, you're right. Most times it's very difficult for them to trust that they don't proactively spray
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
post spray. But anyway,
Every time I go home to Southern California to visit family, I'll meet with the active growing cannabis homies from high school. Normally it's 4 to 5 people, and we'll sit down and I'll just break them down on what we're doing and try to provide value to their farms. And this last time we did that, one of my friends, about an hour after I kind of broke down all the science of what was happening at his farm, he came up to me, he was like, I never even had the thought that you can have cannabis without bugs. I have only seen cannabis with bugs and cannabis with mold. And I said, I never thought that was even an option, to let alone look for a path towards that as an option. And I was the opposite. I started early on because the mentors I had didn't have a lot of bug and pest problems. They did a really good job. And so I had the glimmer of hope that it could be done without it. And I think most farmers are so programmed in their peer group. Most of your friends battle problems, And so most people think we're loony bin or get offended.
because it's common.
Yeah, when
It's
we
common.
mention that there can be pest or mold-free cannabis. In living soil, the easiest thing to do is have powdery mildew-free cannabis if you're following the principles guided by the microscope methods of Dr. Lane and using actual biological. We can knock that out in a 14-day period and it never return. That is the easiest thing on the planet.
Yeah.
Bugs takes a 3-pronged approach of managing weekly fertility and managing soil chemistry and first and foremost managing biology. But we can very often have bug and mold-free facilities. Oftentimes there's a aspect of commercial cultivation that lends itself to pockets of bugs, so locations of dehumidifiers or imbalance of the soil in the early stages. And so you do have to manage pests. But when a farmer is able to take the journey with us, to trust that if they stop spraying IPM products for a 2-week period and manage soil chemistry and manage biology, we will navigate them away from bugs and powdery mildew every single time they have a facility that will support that. So if you have a horrible environment, you're going to have some pest pressure. But if things are put together worth a shit, it's actually quite easy to do if you understand the mathematical targets we're after and you understand the pathway. But most importantly, the farmer has got to be on board that is a reality, or they will always constantly spray IPM. And that will constantly keep you in a self-fulfilling prophecy of, I will have bugs, therefore I'll spray IPM. And mathematically, this book says that you will get more bugs. And so, that's where it starts to get kind of woo-woo, and you got to trust in the mystic a little bit. But that's why we do data points, so we're not trusting in the magical mystic.
Yeah.
So,
well, and so we talk about that in that, the part of the reason why we do the testing is because we've gotten so far away from what it really should look like, what health should look like. If we truly believe that nature is intelligent, that it carries within its DNA the ability to be completely autonomously healthy, then what we need to take our rightful position and go, okay, well, how do we support that and believe in, How do we express that potential from the plant, right? So we use these scientific techniques to recalibrate our intuition and what we're reading in the field, what we're reading from the plant. What is the biology telling us? Now that I've got this history of reading what my biology is saying and marrying that to what I'm seeing in the field in the above ground plant biomass and behavior, what is that retraining my intuition to actually cue into? What are those new cues about what my soil moisture should be, what the leaves are telling me in nutritional deficits or whatever's going on there? We use this data to retrain our intuition and to know that we actually are rebuilding our soil and making it better over time. Not just shooting in the dark, not saying that we're doing IMOs or whatever, that we're actually quantifying it so that we know that through quantification we're actually getting the results. And that's the other thing that I wanted to say is that we talk about regenerative approaches. If you are truly aligning with nature, you should be seeing thriving results that tell you that you are indeed aligning with the intelligence of nature, that you are actually enabling that plant to thrive in the quality, in the yield, in the fact that you're not inundated with diseases and pests. So if you're doing a technique that you think is regenerative or you've been told is regenerative, but your results are still pests and still diseases, then something about what you're doing is not in alignment with regenerative techniques, is not in alignment with nature. And that's just the math of it. Nature is always going to be moving in forward progression, in increasing succession and increasing diversity and increasing harmony and complexity in her systems to reach stability and health. She's always going to be moving in that direction. If she comes into an environment that's selecting against that, she'll bring in pathogens and pests to bring that plant back into the soil and recycle it. And then she can start the progression again. And so she's always moving towards health and well-being and stability and harmony in the system, always. So if your regenerative techniques are not lending itself to that as the result, then something about what you're doing is not regenerative, or you're missing, maybe you're misunderstanding, or maybe you're...
The advice was bad.
Maybe the advice was bad, maybe the application of it, or from understanding to application, there's something amiss there, because it should equate to health, well-being, and thriving. That is the natural state of the expression of a healthy genetics, that we absolutely believe in the intelligence of nature. We've seen it time and time again. We've seen it even in, Arden Anderson talks about this, that if you give the organism an opportunity to heal, like if you take away all of the toxins and the issues that are preventing it from being healthy, it will take that opportunity and it will heal. It has the intelligence to do that. I see that with humans and I see that with plants. If you provide it the components, it will do that. So
we see that with cannabis right now. The virus is the big woogie boogie man, and it's like if you just limit toxicity and provide the opportunity for healing, the viruses go away, y'all. It's not the plague. It's pretty easy to fix from our standpoint.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to load up.
Sorry, I was laughing at David King says, when you're aligned with nature, the bears are still assholes.
Yeah. Well, there we go.
Well, bears will
no,
still
they
be
are,
bears, and we don't ask them to not be bears.
Like Joel says, you got to honor the bareness of the bear, and they're going to be a bear. And if you put blood meal in the hole, they're going to dig up your cannabis plant, and that's a whole different story.
It's going to be a cannabis plant.
You're still, that's a whole different story. But I'm going to need to load an amen button up on this old thing here, because it got hot up in here like a church. But that's why I like it. You just throw some shit out there sometimes. It's like, where are we going? Like, seriously, where are we going, regenerative community, and what are we going to do? So,
I just wanted to say that because, does that really get talked about very much? That, we've gotten so far away from our baseline of actual health, both in our soils and our plants and in us, because we're a top-level predator. It can't help but not be in us. We're at the top of the food chain. So, you know, we need a reset. We need it to be talked about that health is natural and actually normal. It's currently not very common. Currently, we're in an epidemic of chronic diseases and pests and diseases, but that's not the normal and natural state. And
Whew. There we go. I muted that rant. I don't even know what happened, but
oh shoot.
anyways. But
Dang.
yeah, so what she was saying is we got to act, fam. And how are we going to act? And I think we're going to circle back to some practical applications. Sorry about the little sound blip. Not really sure what happened there, but we'll make a whole episode on that business. Yeah. So I think let's get back to the less volatile topics, which would be like Smiley's Garden. So, and maybe we should use the Odyssey platform. I don't know. But so what Smiley was asking about way back up here in the beginning, he's got some root knot nematodes. Yeah. And so on a most simple standpoint, if you're dealing with a root-feeding nematode, this is where I go all in on the education of Dr. Elaine, and every bit of my work experience has shown that this statement is true. And there's a line in the sand, which we show a graph a lot, and it looks kind of like a pH scale, raises a lot of ruckus in the community. But when you drop below a certain part per million of oxygen in the soil, certain organisms wake up and other organisms go to sleep. And at this very distinct line of 4 to 6 parts per million is below 4, it starts to get really haywire. Above 6 parts per million of oxygen in your soil, those nematodes cannot even function as a matter of their biology, and they either die or they go dormant until oxygen drops below 4 parts per million again, which would be the environment for them to thrive. And every bit of our consulting experience, from a 4x4 tent to some of the largest farms around the planet, is perfectly in line with this concept that Dr. Elaine communicates, that all of the pathogens, diseases, and problem child exist in decreased oxygen, or thrive or take over or dominate in decreased oxygen situations. And so on a very simple basis, and I think this is where Sarah and I really excel, that a lot of farmers have a hard time going along with us, is I'm less concerned about the pathogen or the problem. I'm less concerned about the specificity of the bug. If there's a soil-borne pathogen, fusarium, root rot, root-feeding nematode, it simply tells you you are far too low on the dissolved oxygen in your soil, which is causing those anaerobic indicators to thrive, because that is their function in the environment. So the only times that we see root-feeding nematodes in our work, which isn't very common, usually it at least has to do with municipal compost sources, because they come through on that material. I don't even think most potting soils contain them to then inoculate them. So the questions I would ask is, where are they originally being inoculated from? Is it the compost source? If you're doing compost extracts, what is the quality of that compost you're inoculating with? what was the original quality of the compost in your soil. And that's not a death sentence. That's just, I'm trying to think out loud so people can come along the journey with me. And to me, that's a simple problem. We just put them to sleep.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
you know.
I'd like to say something.
Say it, Sarah.
Okay.
Just don't get censored again and get muted and shit.
All right, so we do come across root feeding nematodes from time to time. We've never used a nematicide, and we've never needed to. We literally just establish the soil food web and go into aerobic conditions, like Scott says. But part of the details of utilizing the soil food web is that when it comes to bacterial feeding nematodes, they will literally keep that root feeding nematode from finding its food source because they have a vested interest in keeping that plant healthy. So they'll release chemicals to keep that root feeding nematode away from the root source or from its food source, the roots, and they will literally keep it from getting to the food source pretty effectively, actually. Root feeding nematodes, if you don't move out of anaerobic conditions, they will multiply, and they'll multiply rather quickly. They can have 100 babies per mother in 10 days' time, or even a week's time. So you have got to keep your soil aerobic, and you have got to make sure that you have bacterial feeding nematodes in there at the very least. So those are some tips and tricks to making sure that you can just literally move out of that zone that's selecting for them. So whether you inherited them, and you need to know whether you have them in your soil. So that's a good case for actually getting your soil tested rather than waiting for the results to show up and show you, hey, we got a problem here. Yeah. So so make sure that you get bacterial feeding nematodes into your system and make sure that you're keeping your soils aerobic. Yeah. And what aerobic means to somebody who's tracking soil food web, that water volume that we know is aerobic and will lend itself to a robust living soil system is different than what most people would think is not overwatering. Yeah. We've had some growers, not very often, most people do believe us on the watering, but we had one particular grower who was adamant that he was not overwatering, but every time I got the soil, it was saturated, and the results showed it in the soil food web. So you've got to be able to understand that when you're working with a true soil food web, you've got actual fungi in the system and other organisms in the system. You're going to need a certain level of water, but it's going to be a less water than you think, and it will hold on to more water than most soils do that are lacking the soil food web, specifically the fungi. Yeah. So it is a different baseline and a different threshold that you need to be able to adjust to. And you can't really know that until you start looking at your organisms in the soil to what that new baseline of water really should be.
Yeah. So from a short functional answer on what to do is, generally speaking, something has driven your soil anaerobic for long enough time for those nematodes to wake up and perform their function perfectly in nature, which is remove the higher level plants from that decreasing oxygen environment. And so the first question is, what is causing a decreased oxygen environment? The most common thing is watering. The next most common thing is what us soil food web graduates would define as improper management of biology. Even though it may be popular, it's not likely correct from a biological standpoint. And so, that's wild. So you could see the knots. You could actually see the nematode. They were the smallest of the nematodes, or you saw the nugs, like it was like nodules. But back to the quick answer is, if I was hired as a consultant to come fix this problem, we could fix it in 7 days. And I don't even need to be there for the whole 7 days. So the first thing I would do is identify what is keeping the soil or pushing it anaerobic and stop it. Whether that's any sort of KNF anaerobic stuff, I would throw that out the window immediately. You're never going to convince me that stuff is going to be beneficial for cannabis plants. I've not seen one situation where it has done anything other than cause disease. So if you're doing any KNF, I would shit can that. And then I would stop that cycle, and we can, got to be careful with this type of information because you can really screw your soil up. But if I was brought to that farm, I would give a light conservative dose of citric acid, which would lightly sterilize the anaerobes in the soil and give you an opportunity to radically change direction.
Which you must do at that point.
Which you must do at that point. So if you repeatedly put citric acid in your soil, that's why I asked that question, you will create these root feeding nematodes. That was why I asked. I think, Smiley's a really important figure in the journey of all living soil people, and I really respect that he takes in all the information and shares his journey honestly. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Smiley for being so, even saying that he has a problem publicly. Yep. Nobody does that. Everybody's perfect, right?
And that's how we learn.
And so generally speaking, identify what's making it anaerobic, stop that now, gently sterilize with citric acid. The next time you need water, you then inoculate and go the other direction without turning anaerobic. And you could correct that problem in a 7-day period. Yeah. Typically, radical changes can be made in 7 to 10 days. We've come to farms in our professional consulting where that farm is a powdered donut of powdery mildew, and in 7 days it's all gone after making the proper corrections and changes. So, and this is the part where it gets sticky for me because I feel a need to honestly and completely educate those that are listening, which usually then contradicts advice from other advisors. So I think it's great that you're focusing on soil chemistry, and I think it's fantastic that you're working with Bryant Mason. The one concern I have about Bryant's work is his complete disregard of biology and biological functions, and the advice that he gives is often very downright antagonistic to the living part of living soil. And I think, Bryant's a great voice. He's very active. He's very out there. He's getting it done publicly. I think that's fantastic. I think it would do him and everybody he helps a great service for him to take a legitimate understanding of soil food web techniques and understanding how his advice is very antagonistic to soil communities, which would then lead to anaerobic conditions and root knot nematodes. So if you're going to be an advisor and engage in living soil communities or living soil systems, you can't just disregard the biological component of it. I came into this as a biology guy and found that I could not disregard the chemistry aspect. And I had to also become an expert in soil chemistry to the level that I am an expert in biology. And you can't just neglect these functions of nature that are going to happen whether you want them to or not. And, so that's why I asked, exactly. Worst thing you can do is put hydrogen peroxide into a living soil. You want to take it from gnats to russet mites in a 14-day period. That's the way to do it. That's the thing. The reason why I learned the microscope originally was because I wanted to be in control of my information. I didn't need anybody. I could answer every single question on my own. Because I'm capable of doing soil chemistry, I can take a data point and I'm completely empowered to make any decision I need to do for success. With the microscope specifically, you can fine-tune everything from the air circulation in your building, to the water quantity, to the minerals that you use, to the types of amendments that you use. Just generally speaking of the little bit that I know about Smiley's Garden, I would think that, substituting out some of the sulfates for non-sulfate forms, that's one of the main things I do. I use amino acid forms of trace minerals. I really minimize the use of sulfates. I only use potassium sulfate occasionally. I very rarely use sulfate forms of trace minerals. So we went and sourced other ones. I'll drop them in the chat here. So here's a link to all the products we use for soil amending. And then for biologically complete compost, same thing. I'm obviously a big fan of our compost. We were the first to produce commercial quantities of truly biologically complete compost. I haven't put it on the website now because honestly, I kind of suck at product-based businesses. I'm trying to be better. But we now have HB and SF nematodes in all of our compost that goes out the door. We haven't even added it to the website yet, but for the last month or so, every box of compost has gone out pre-inoculated with predatory nematodes. So if you're a small-time grower, that is a massive savings. So I would consider using less sulfates. The reason why I asked about the citric acid treatment, that's common advice to use citric acid to pH correct. Citric acid is the damn near most antimicrobial thing you can put into a living soil system, save for hydrogen peroxide, sanidate, xylitol. A tiny bit of citric acid to pH correct is nuking everything. And if you're nuking everything, you are constantly putting yourself into the potential for anaerobic conditions. So the thing that people need to understand about biological system is species survival rates will dictate all of these outcomes. So in nature, it's not natural for spider mites to get completely wiped out. So because there's natural controls and natural balance of systems that keep them in check, spider mites will crap out thousands of babies, whereas a ladybug does 2. So if you go in and you nuke everything, the next day that ladybug that survives is going to drop out 2 babies, and every 3 to 5 days that spider mite's going to drop thousands of babies. Who's going to win that race? And so same thing is happening in the soil. If you come through 3 times a week and water with a sprinkling of citric acid, you are guaranteeing powdery mildew pressure through the species survival rates of the water molds, the omycetes, the anaerobic fungi, the disease-causing fungi, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, root-borne pathogens.
They're the first to come back.
They're the first to come back, and you are guaranteeing their existence in that environment. And so that's why we are so dead set on not spraying to kill, and why we very rapidly eliminate all pesticide products as soon as it's appropriate, is because we understand that every time you go in there and spray to kill, you are having a downstream effect on the soil that will keep persistent.
Keep you in that loop.
It'll keep you in that pressure loop. And, so this context, right? So context, in order for something to be true, the content needs to fit the context. And so it might be true that citric acid is the most natural pH down. The other component of that is if you put that into a living soil, it is one of the most antimicrobial things you can put into the soil. Yeah. So much so, it is my preferred tool for sterilizing a soil when there's a pathogen problem. And so if you're putting just a tiny amount of to pH down, that might be fine. You might correct the pH. I would argue that pH probably doesn't even need to be corrected at all. So putting citric acid into your feeds simply for moving of the pH, is it even necessary? If it's in a true living soil, thriving biological system, anything from 6 to 7 pH is perfectly tolerable as long as mineral chemistry is balanced in that feed. My personal preferred, I'll drop it in the chat here for you. When we work with a farmer that really wants to affect pH, which typically are the conversion, so those are the salt-based growers coming into living soil are hyper-focused on pH. They don't believe me that pH can be left alone as long as between 6 and 7, and they must lower that pH. We use Organics Alive, exactly. We use Organics Alive FPF. That shit will plunge pH like you wouldn't believe. I just would put the asterisk, do not exceed 2 milliliters per gallon. I know other people go as high as 5. I don't agree that that's a good idea. Typically, somewhere between 1 and 2 milliliters per gallon will drop that nutrient solution, 0.4, 0.6 points. You can drop it all the way from 7 to 6.2 with a couple milliliters. If it's in RO water, it goes faster. If it's in very alkaline well water, it goes less. And that's where you need to decide what lane you want to be in. Do you want perfect pH and grow in rock wool? Have at it. If you're going to grow in living soil systems, you should understand the context of what that living soil system actually wants. That living soil system doesn't want citric acid. I don't care who says it's natural. It fucking kills everything. I mean, we've been doing that since like 2017. If a farm hires me to kill powdery mildew, I wash it with citric acid and then re-inoculate. So this living soil system doesn't want the citric acid, loves Organics Alive FPF. Loves it. So you're achieving the same goal of gently moving pH with providing something that's advantageous. So citric acid is only lowering pH, and that's the thing that we clean lines with. It's breaking apart organic compounds and undoing the natural holding of nutrients in the soil. It doesn't make any sense to me personally. But when you provide fulvic acid, you're accelerating the uptake of phosphate. You're accelerating all nutrients into the plant, because all nutrients except for 3 require attaching to phosphate to move through the plant. So fulvic acid accelerates the uptake of phosphorus, which accelerates the uptake of all nutrients. You can get rid of a powdery mildew problem by simply accelerating the movement of phosphate through the plant with fulvic acid. So I think you need to ask yourself, like, what do I want to do? What is the context of my system? Is that are you trying to do living soil? If you're trying to do living soil, a primary focus, in my opinion, should be limiting antimicrobial compounds. That means everything from spraying neem oil to Eagle 20s, really antimicrobial. Anything you spray on the plant will drift down and have some level of killing of soil organisms. In certain situations, if you spray a heavy-duty IPM product like Eagle 20 or some other systemic nonsense, the plant will take its sunlight energy to move that toxic compound into the root zone, and it will nuke that entire soil volume back to the Stone Ages with one application. And so if you're going to do living soil, primary focus should be, I'm going to eliminate or limit any activities that are antimicrobial. And I'm going to focus on and select on things that gently stimulate and support the growth of healthy biological communities. So one easy thing would be ditch the IPM products and deal with pests through nutrition. It would be, maybe less of a focus on a specific pH, understanding that there might be 1,000 different pH fluctuations in that root zone if you're truly doing living soil. If you're truly doing living soil, that entire root zone should be covered with biology that is managing and affecting and changing pH. So what is the point of moving a solution 0.2 on the pH? What is that going to do for you, right? So I would always put the balance of what you're feeding over the pH. And in my opinion, as long as it's between 6 and 7 and mineral balance is correct, you don't need to change it. If you want to change it, use fulvic acid. That's my rant. That's my big old rant. So let's see. Let's get back on track here. Obviously I'm a big fan of our compost. I linked in the chat there.
They do a lot of work for us. We consider them our team. Mm-hmm. They do so much. So, everything that we do obviously is based around making sure that they thrive. Yeah. Everything we feed, all of our minerals that we give, all of that is to make sure that they're thriving and nothing is hindering them.
Yeah, and we in 2017, we redesigned the old ancient tea bag and put a flat bottom on it. And what we found was you got 20% better extraction by having a flat bottom tea bag.
Especially if you're doing machine extraction.
Yeah, especially if you're doing. I'm completely mind blown. The entire industry hasn't switched to it. A couple of the tea bag manufacturers did everything they could to keep those from being made because most of the industry is adverse to innovation. But I'm still shocked that more people aren't copying the flat bottom extract bag, because you typically get like 20 to 30% more organisms out of that compost when you simply make a flat bottom bag.
Just make sure that whatever extract bag you are using or tea bag, make sure that it's 400 microns and not smaller than that. Yeah. Otherwise, you won't be able to get out the organisms that you're working so hard to make sure are establishing. So,
Yeah, so whatever you got going on, the balance of your water with the balance of the nutritions are coming out 6.4. That's pretty good. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. Again, I always put nutrient balance above some sort of pH number. And just kind of food for thought, any traditional hydroponic ups or downs are the other most antimicrobial compounds, and that's a complete fool's goal to use traditional up and down products for nutrient solutions going into a living soil. So if pH needs to go up, you probably don't have enough calcium in the mix. If pH needs to go down, I would consider the balance between the trace minerals and potassium, phosphorus, and calcium, and I would gently lower that with fulvic acid. So
I wanted to ask the audience, like, are there other topics, like in the food or health realm that you want us to talk about? There's many things that we're very interested in and we've been following that are fairly probably cutting edge, I would think. And, we're very interested in just having conversations about what health is, food, things like that. If there's anybody that you want us to consider bringing onto the show or whatever, we're all ears.
Drop it in the chat. What do you want to know about?
Yeah,
We've lost such context with what the average grower out there needs to know at this point, because we've gone so down the rabbit hole of trying to learn everything we possibly could. So the only pH up I've used is the one from Eden, and I do like Eden's products, but man, that pH, that hydroxide, that shit's a garbage. Bless their heart, that product is whack. I've never tried the Nectar because we don't tend to have a pH up problem because we're balancing calcium, magnesium, potassium, nitrogen, and trace minerals. We never need to raise it up. So there's one problem you will run into if you're building your fertility on reverse osmosis water. So the one major difference between using like the Organic Alive soluble powders, which we're big fans of, is if you try to put large quantities of those products into RO water, it will very handily drop that pH below 6. So the one major difference between the strategy appropriate for the context of hydroponics and the difference in the context for living soil is in hydroponics, as the plant grows through its life cycle, it's customary to increase the solution strength or increase EC or increase the parts per million as the plant grows. And you can just simply change the pH, which also changes nutrient balance, which I object to, but nonetheless, that's the standard strategy. If you're going to use the Organics Alive powders, and especially in RO water, there's only a certain point you can raise that ppm level to before you radically drop pH. So the way that you manage increasing EC as the plant grows is you increase the volume of the nutrient solution that you are giving to those plants. So you only build that fertility up to the certain point before it drops below 6.0, and then you provide more of that solution as the plants grow. That's the one major difference, and that's how we attack it. So because we approach it that way, we never need a pH up. The only time we've needed a pH up is when we took a hydro guy that was dead set on throwing spoonfuls of that shit. And I've only done it a couple times, and I just don't work that way anymore because it takes us out of what we know works. So a couple other random questions. We don't focus on balancing the minerals in the compost. We focus on balancing the inputs to that compost and focus on biological populations. Interestingly enough, when you aim for a goal of really high biological complete compost and give it a long time, it ends up fairly balanced and you don't need to do anything. Todd Harrington from Harrington's Organic, that's a guy that's typically shouted out on the Living Soil. He does balance his compost. I just don't personally feel it's that necessary. So we don't. It doesn't mean you can't. It doesn't mean it can't be beneficial. I talked to a guy today that's been doing a lot of really interesting compost techniques, and he has done some mineral chemistry balancing of compost and got some great results. I just don't think for the context of our needs it's necessary. So I would love to have Zach Bush in. Yeah, if you know him, holler. Big fans of that. And Stephanie Seneff. That was the one time Sarah and I went to a talk of
2016.
That's when like they talk about this cognitive dissonance when like you're laid upon some information that it went woo. There was about a half an hour where I blacked out. I was so overwhelmed. Whew.
That's where she was really laying it down.
Glyphosate.
The first time that we had really heard the connection between glyphosate and like 27 different other comorbidities and diseases, and most of them were actually cancers of elimination organs, so kidneys and liver and pancreas and things like that. So,
Yeah.
so it was a
Bad
very
news.
interesting conversation to be part of or
Yeah.
listen in on that. And it was Moms Across America, I think, was putting it on. And just really bold, brave woman to be able to come out and
gets
talk about
completely
it
heckled
like
off.
that.
She's, I mean,
and then since then, Zach Bush, of course, has come
Yeah.
on scene and really tied it all together with, the shikimate pathway that's then disrupted and how that then disrupts our health, which brings us back to the whole food issue when we don't have these microbes because we're nuking the soil and we're disrupting specifically that particular pathway, this thing called the shikimate pathway. Then we disrupt the 9 essential amino acids that we cannot produce. We have to get them from our food. And if our food is being produced without that particular pathway because the microbial communities have been disrupted, then we literally have food completely devoid of these 9 essential amino acids. And so
in short, herbicide stops a plant from producing the 9 essential amino acids that your body requires it can't produce on its own.
And it's not just you that requires them. It's pretty much all life above that particular chain right there.
No big deal.
Yeah.
About once a year, sometimes twice a year, we'll do a ground up designing of a facility.
We definitely do design a grow.
I say this in the most loving way possible. It's my least favorite thing to do because it's the greatest demand on intellectual property for proportionally the lowest dollar amount. Nobody ever wants to pay what you're worth to design a successful grow in the beginning. Guys that I used to consult for, so I used to provide support to other advisors in the commercial space that were above me. Those guys used to get 40, 50 grand for what people barely want to pay $10,000 for now. So I pick 1 or 2 farms per year that I'm personally invested in, either because the person I think has potential to be a top 1% farm, and we will design them a facility. And this last year, we've done 2. We took 2 projects on where we do full blueprint design, and it usually takes an entire year. So usually on the hook for an entire year, and the greatest demand of everything on the first day is facility design. So we typically team or pair with somebody that we really believe in or think has a legitimate possibility to be top 1% farm, and we do that.
And then we know is going to listen to what we have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're trying to like triple decker that shit, everybody wants to do corny stuff like that or put a living soil bed in a hydroponic tray. I can't get with any of that stuff. And so most people can't hear you that you shouldn't be putting living soil beds on rolling benches or multi-tier racks or hydroponic trays, and they just don't listen to you. So we do it about once or twice a year. So Sarah does a whole class on vermicomposting at home. So she has a class on our website where she walks you through the entire process of going through, wouldn't you say?
Not really specifically on vermicomposting. It's part of the bioreactor that I do on. It's a video. You can just purchase the video and then take the course. So it's the second half of making a bioreactor is the vermicomposting part.
Yeah.
But if you want just vermicomposting itself, I'm going to tell you different things than what a lot of people will tell you that are standard on vermicomposting because I'm after a certain biological population. Yeah. So you still vermicompost and it's very successful, but it just is going to be different than what the standard vermicomposting is out there. So,
generally speaking, the problems with home vermicomposting is trying to cram too much in there too fast, and you're just going to make really low quality compost. So if your goal is to have a worm bin and get rid of food scraps, you can do that. It's just not going to make biologically complete compost. And if you want to make biologically complete compost, I've had really good results in a standard worm bin and a tote. Mix up a little bit of soil, a little bit of potting soil, a little bit of peat, a little bit of cocoa, give it some mass. Put a good, worms don't like wood chips until they start to break down, but in order to get good vermicompost, it needs to be very carbon rich. And that means it's going to take a lot longer to break down, which most people trying to do vermicompost aren't willing to do that. And they end up just making subpar anaerobic compost. So you need to be able to let it take time. And I've found the best results when you're not constantly putting more stuff in there. So build up the mass in the Tupperware with an appropriate mixture of, like you're making a potting soil essentially. And, make sure you got predominantly woody materials in there. And then you need to inoculate with something. So a handful or two of our compost would be a really great choice. Or going into a natural forest system and getting a little Ziploc bag of cores from Healthy System and put that in there. If you don't inoculate it, it's not going to be...
Yeah, the organisms have to
You have to
get in
put
there
them in
somehow.
there, right?
Yeah.
Or it's going to take 150 years for a worm bin at your house to just become biologically complete. We don't have that time. So, and just keep it moist,
That fish
So-
up their backyard medicine.
I have seen this product. I'm really careful about talking about products, especially some that are popular and produce a lot of effort to market their materials. The objection I have to the fish shit one is it's forcing it to be anaerobic, and I don't participate in any anaerobicdom. I don't participate in any anaerobic anything.
Well, there's a couple of reasons why.
I never. You're not going to get me.
Yeah, the one is just the anaerobic process itself, but two is really that when they do process these fish products, it lends itself to eventually an actual imbalance in the soil based on this exchangeable hydrogen value.
Yeah.
And so it tends to climb rather quickly the more fish products that you use, and it can lead to a very unstable, problematic soil that is very hard to grow anything without complete catastrophic pests.
Yeah.
So,
I think I'll say I think aquaponics is great. I've built aquaponics systems around the actual world. I've built them successful aquaponics systems in Haiti. I've built them in schools in Southern California.
We did a bioassay on somebody who did a
He
successful.
did pretty good, yeah. I'm an aquaponics fan. What I've learned in my soil food web journey is the soil food web organisms in an aquatic environment is not really the ones that your plants are looking for in the soil. And so I think the more you try to force these aquaponics environments into a soil system, you're kind of asking for problems because you're asking a chicken to be a duck, and you just need to let the duck be a duck over here, and you need to let the chicken be a chicken over here. And so for me, that particular product has two strikes on it. One is it's fish compost based, which is if you do a ton of it, you're going to increase exchangeable hydrogen, which will displace calcium and mess up base saturation and give you bugs, which we've seen a lot of times with fish hydrolysates and fish-based compost and lobster-based compost and all these marine products. So I'm not going to get on board with that. And then it's forced into being anaerobic. And so even if you take healthy aerobic organisms that are appropriate for the root zone of higher level plants like cannabis, and you put them to sleep, you're going to lose most of those organisms in that process trying to put it into a shelf-stable
product.
Oxygen-free, I don't know if it wouldn't be anoxic, I guess. It would be anaerobic. But nonetheless, significantly decreased oxygen. You're trying to put them to sleep with chemicals so that it can stay. And to me, that's just way too many things away from taking good biologically complete compost and putting it on your root zone. I think that's just what you should be doing.
Well,
personally.
and they say, and especially when we were starting out, Elaine even talks about fish being fungal food, right? We have not really seen that be the case. We've said this a few times on here, but we've seen that really those fish type products end up stimulating the wrong fungal
Powdery
communities.
mildew.
Yeah, so it'll end up stimulating, and it's very stimulating, even a small amount. So you can get that bloom, that fuzz that everybody thinks is lovely, but it's actually anaerobic organisms, pathogens. So
you want to make powdery mildew covered cannabis, give it a whole bunch of fish products.
Yeah. So just food for thought. It's when we're trying to grow our fungi, that's not the food that we use. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well,
did we do it?
We did a long ways.
Yeah.
I think we covered a lot of ground. I think we said enough to get censored a bit for there. I think we scared the shit out of people. Hopefully we encouraged people. Hopefully we dropped some functional, usable knowledge. Hopefully we didn't offend too many other gurus this week.
Yeah, hopefully we inspired you to actually grow food and do something to restore your soils. And, you know, obviously if you're listening to us, you care about this stuff. So we just appreciate you being here and listening to this and giving a shit and being part of the generation that is going to fix this, because the buck stops with us. There's nobody else that's really going to be able to do this. I'm convinced that as we degenerate with this degenerative type of food substances, that we won't see very many generations that have the capability of actually turning this around.
Yeah,
So,
no pressure,
no
but,
pressure, but
Stephanie Seneff, the lady we mentioned earlier, predicts that by 2032, 2 out of 3 African American boys in the United States will be born autistic.
Yeah.
And 1 out of
Talk about debilitating a nation.
Yeah, and for some reason it affects that the more melanated people more, which is kind of interesting. But it's still very dire for any race, religion, or creed, based on the way we're farming. And I mean, we're literally on our way to humans that cannot function as a physical, biological being because of the way we're choosing to farm. And we're here to make effect in cannabis because we love getting high on that sweet, sweet Chiba. And this community is the most open to what we have to say. That's why we hang out in cannabis. And at some point, the people that grow our food will start to come around. We're starting to see it. Yeah. We're starting to see some market gardeners on our channel, which I think is fantastic. I would say that 2019 was a critical changing point in living soil. 2 major things happened. In cannabis, we started having salt-based cultivators in Southern California that were highly respected for their hydroponics, that were building out 100,000 square foot facilities, that were willing to take a leap into this living soil thing that they've never really seen in person, but they've smoked the extracts and consumed the product.
And they've gotten the yield.
And gotten the yield.
So that got their attention, yeah.
Psst, the hash returns on living soil is double that of hydroponics. And so that's literally hundreds of thousands of dollars out of a back bedroom if you're, always running Dank or one of the other homies that's really on the extract tip. But nonetheless, I digress. At that same time, at that same month, I talked to the first food farmer that I believed was truly in their heart ready to do this living soil thing properly. And so we're a couple years into, this is literally Wild West shit. We are on the front of a brand new thing that is forever going to change agriculture. And I know a lot of you cannabis growers are seeing, the market get kind of snuffy. The reason why we're talking about Joel Salatin, that man's pulling out $1.2 million a year in chickens, fam.
Just the chickens.
Just the chickens. That's way more than any weed money. I've only known a couple dudes that made that type of weed money. So I think there's some tremendous opportunity for real farmers that do soil chemistry, that do biological methods, that grow rabbits and chickens and vegetable crops. I think it's a little bit harder to develop a market for high-value market foods than it is to just dump some herb, but people are doing it.
This is why we have to get the word out about it. So, I mean, you can't, the thing is that when we say 2 out of 3, or what is it, 2 out of 3 or 1 out of 3 boys in
it's like something just wrecked. It's 2, I think it's 2 out of 3 African American males will be born autistic by 2032, and like 1.5 out of 3 or 2, I don't know, something
like that, like 1 in 3. That is so profoundly debilitating to a nation. Like, I can't even stress to you, because how many adults does that take out? Now these capable adults have to spend all of their time, energy, and money taking care of an autistic child that doesn't even need to be autistic. Yeah. I mean, we could be turning this around, So we have to turn around the chronic disease rates. I mean, I guarantee that everybody out here has somebody in their family or friends that has cancer, that has autism, that has all of these, any and all of these chronic diseases. And it's just at epidemic rates, and we've just got to do something about it. Yeah. So it touches everybody, and it has to be, it has to be with food. I know that cannabis can help us bridge this gap and get us off some of these pharmaceuticals, but it also has to be the food. We have to tackle this food issue.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So shout out, it's, consider yourself at the forefront. I'd look into Moms Across America. They're, I don't have any personal firsthand experience with the changes in ranges on the spectrum, I guess you would say. But Moms Across America is making some pretty serious claims about dietary changes and the lessening of symptoms. I'm not sure what the real appropriate word set is.
Well, there has been some curing of autism just by switching up the food and cleaning it up and going organic. But there's also another human that you should follow for that autism issue and just cleaning up the diet in general, all around good advice. She's a functional nutritionist, and her name is Kathleen DiChiara. So that's DiChiara, DiChiara. And she has had a couple of really great sessions of speaking and presenting her material at the Bionutrient Food Association a couple of years back. She also has released a book on how to actually clean up the diet and get back to health. She had to do it for herself, but she also has an autistic son that she had to bring back to health as well. So she's very well versed in understanding what it takes to get that health back. So I highly recommend her work as well. So Mark Hyman, he's a great one as well. There's some really good, bold physicians that are leaving the system and really speaking out. Hyman is one of them. Thomas Cowan is another one, or Cohen. Zach Bush, obviously, is also another one. And Arden Anderson, one of my favorites, is also another one. So lots of great people to show us the way forward, and step out of the norm and the collective consciousness that's just doesn't even know that there's an issue, really. So.
Yeah, man. Start with a few, and just do it like you do the cannabis. And, you just need some life force in there grown
microbes
with
and minerals.
Higher level, focus on some herbs. A lot of people neglect the healing power of herbs other than cannabis, same type of things. So I think we got way down deep the rabbit hole. It's good to, come in hot and heavy after a little break. And the things we have planned for the future are, we get a lot of requests about what books to advise, and you can't read them back here. So one of the upcoming, either next week or the following week, we're going to do a breakdown of books that we found are valuable.
Yeah. I'd like to do a book review, actually. There's a book that I think that we should collectively read and speak about. So if you want to join us, it's the new book by Anne Beakley, I think is her last name, and David Montgomery on What Your Food Ate. They just did a really lovely webinar on this at the Bionutrient Food Association with those authors. I'd love to be able to read that book because they went really deep down the rabbit hole of all of these medicinal compounds that should be in the food that are missing, and just how that plays out in what we're seeing in the major populace now. So I'm going to be reading that book over the next couple of weeks, and then we'll come on the show. So if you want to join us in that discussion, I highly recommend you also read that book. And then who knows, maybe we'll have the authors on the show
That'd be cool.
and or Dan Kittredge on the show at some point to talk about what they're doing at the Bionutrient Food Association.
This old thing. That'd be cool. This old thing.
Yeah.
But and another stuff, we want to cover some just basic components of Living Soul. I think we've gotten pretty scattered on some very high-level topics, and so we want to kind of circle back to start with these 5 basic components. So drop in the chat if you have any preference, if you'd rather hear about the books, or you'd rather hear about the basic fundamentals of Living Soil, and that's what we'll do next week. And we'll just keep continuing the shit show rodeo every Wednesday, most Wednesdays.
Yeah. If you have a
7 p.m.
suggestion for a
Mountain
book, like
Standard
on this
Time.
book club thing, so we'll start with What Your Food Ate, but if you have a suggestion, you can drop us a line at info@cressivesoil.org. Just let us know, hey, maybe you should cover this book. I think Healthy Crops will be on there as a book, too, that I think everybody should read because it's just so eye-opening about, where these pesticides lead to. And, it's a really important book to read. And then, there's some other things that we could read as well. So, Healthy Crops is a very dry book, so I'm not sure how many people will really want to read that book. It's very research intensive. But there's other things as well.
Yeah.
I would really like to talk more about nutrition and what it takes to actually achieve health these days, and bring in some of Steiner's work, and tie that into electric health as well. Yeah. So anyway,
we did it.
Here.
Wrap it up.
Yeah.
Wrap it up.
Well, it was great to be back. Thanks for joining us in the conversation.
Shout out to the homies that stick out the whole time and ride along with us. And
we just can't thank you enough for being here and showing up during these sessions. So thanks for being our crew and for being the people that are going to get shit done in this world. So, yep.
Somebody has to do something.
Yeah.
Not now, but right now.